Here we go. Okay, this is week 8 or 7. Sorry, this is week 7. We're looking at inequality and economic myths. Essentially, we're going to be looking at how inequality has been sold to us. Remember, a lot of what we do in sociology is look at how we look at the assumptions we have about the social world that seem natural, that seem obvious, and we showcase how these have actually been constructed by society. So today we'll be looking at how the idea of inequality, the way that society is set up, has actually been constructed um, by a very like a whole century of economic thought and ideas. First, let's look at some key terms. It says two key terms, but it actually means three. We're looking at social stratification, class, and inequality. So social stratification is simply how a society categorizes people into rankings based on various factors like wealth, income, ancestry, skin color, education, power, etc. Social stratification does not necessarily need to result in inequality. You could have ranking, but still give everyone the same things. However, I can't think of an instance in which it hasn't. Social stratification usually does end up in some kind of inequality. A class is a grouping within that stratification system. So, and I'll show you a little bit more on the next page. So it's a grouping of those people within a society based on shared characteristics like wealth, income, ancestry, education, race, etc. Now, inequality is when resources, opportunities, or rewards are unequally distributed. So it's not just, for example, unequal income. That would be unequal outcomes, right? You put in the same amount of work, but you get a different outcome in return. But it's also the opportunity to get that job. And even before that, it's the resources you have been able to gather over time. So, were you born in a good neighborhood? Were you born with parents that have an education and can teach you things? Were you born in a country that has potable water? Those are all resources that lead to you having opportunities that lead to then the different outcomes people have. So sociologists are looking at the inequality of resources, opportunities, and outcomes, not just outcomes. However, most people are when they think of inequality, they think of income, they think of resources or rewards or outcomes. Sometimes they think about opportunities, right? When we look at inequality of getting an education, like did you get into elite colleges? Did you get the jobs? But not often do we think about inequality as that unequal distribution of resources from the very beginning of a person's life. But that's very important in determining the rest. So let's look at two examples of stratification systems. On the left, we have an example of a caste. A caste system is famously found in um, the the Indian country, the country of India, and surrounding areas where you have your ancestry of who your family has been will determine the kind of level within the stratification system you will take, and that is your caste. Whereas in the West, we often have classes that are dependent on where you are working in the economy, whether that is a CEO as part of the 1%, a lawyer or a doctor as a salaried person. Maybe you're in the middle class as like a teacher or some kind of other professional job. And then we have the working poor and the people in poverty. So that would be a class, right? So it's a grouping of people based on a similar characteristic. On the right, we have class system based on economics and income, but we could also imagine a class system based on race, ethnicity, nationality. And so in reality, classes are very nebulous. People are moving through different classes, right? Maybe they are a very wealthy person, but they still reside in a class of African Americans in a middle class neighborhood, right? So they occupy different kinds of classes at the same time. These aren't necessarily fixed, but they help sociologists determine how is the unequal distribution of resources, of opportunities and rewards distributed by any different one of these classes. So one way to visualize inequality is through income inequality. And we're going to do this by visualizing $100. I know that's a lot on the screen at one time. So if you're recording this, feel free to pause. But right now I want you to imagine that all of the American income that every single person has ever, or in this year will get, is divided into these $100 bills. And then we've separated society into 6 classes. We have the poorest 20%, then the next poorest 20%, then the next poorest 20%, right? So we've divided it into 5 20%, and then the top 1%, right? So we have the poorest quintile, then the second quintile, then the third quintile, fourth quintile, the richest quintile, and then the top 1%. What I want you to do is think about how much money do each of these classes take in from this pot of $100, right? So if all of the income in the US was visualized in this $100, how much would each quintile get? If it was a perfectly equal society, since each of these is divided up into a quintile, each one would get 20% of this income for the year, right? The poorest quintile would get 20%, the next quintile would get 20%. However, we don't live in that. So if you're recording this, feel free to pause it, guess how much you think the poorest quintile gets, how much you think the next quintile gets. And then what I'm going to do is through the next couple of slides show you what the reality is of how much each of these groupings brings in every year. So let's start with the poorest quintile. The bottom 20% of the United States, out of all of the income that everyone in the US brings in, they bring in 3.8%. Remember, in a truly equal society, they would have brought in 20%. So they are bringing in less than a fifth of what they would have if it was a truly equal society. So about four of the $100 that the entire US brings in. The next rung, the second quintile, is bringing in about 8.9%. So they're doing a little better than the poorest fifth, but they're still not doing great. The third quintile is bringing in 13.6%. So this is about approaching what we're thinking of the middle class is this third quintile, the 40 to 60%. Then the upper middle class, the fourth quintile, is bringing in about 20.5%. This is exactly what we would think of in an unequal society. However, so we still haven't gotten to 50%, right? We don't know where is this other 50% of the household income going? Where is it going to? And it's coming from the richest quintile. So the top 20% are gathering about 40% of all of America's income distribution. And the top 1% is getting almost 16%. So remember, if this was a truly equal society, we would see that each quintile was getting 20%, whereas in reality, the richest quintile is taking in about 40%. Even beyond that, the top 1% is taking in another 16%. So that's about 55% total is going to the top 20%. The fourth quintile is doing exactly what we would imagine. They're getting about 20%. But the poorest, 60% altogether, 60% of the nation is only bringing in about 25% of the annual income of the US. Now, Taxes and transfers do affect this, right? In the US, we generally have what is called a progressive tax, which means that people in the richest quintiles are taxed a larger percentage. And then through social welfare programs like Section 8 housing, like welfare, like earned income tax credit, some of that money that has been taxed from corporations and the wealthiest are funneled down into the poorer quintiles. Now, once you take into account, there is some, management or changes that we see. So let's go to this next slide, which shows these are the changes after we take into account taxes and transfers. We see that the top 1% and the richest quintile have lost some of that money, right? This is before where they had about 38.5% in the rich quintile and 15.8% for the top 1%. But once we tax them, it drops a little bit, not much. So the top 1% now gets 12.5%, and the richest quintile gets about 35%. The upper middle class doesn't change much. It moves from 20.5 to 20.3. But we see the biggest changes in the poorest quintiles. So the poorest quintile went from 3% to almost 8%. So it more than doubled the amount of money they brought in because of programs like welfare, the earned income tax credit, Section 8 housing. The second quintile moved from around 9% up to 11%. And the third quintile moved from around 13 to 15%. So taxes and transfers are helping a little bit for the people in the poorest groupings of society, but not much. It's still retaining a lot of the income and wealth in the top 20. Are there any questions about what inequality looks like, specifically income inequality, which is an inequality of outcome? Feel free to text or raise your hand. Okay, let's move forward. So what you in the second part of this week, you're looking at what are some of the myths that economics tells us today, especially in the Western world, but also what does that mean for elites in society? So Nick Hanauer is a capitalist who is pushing that we have misunderstood human society in terms of how we understand them as economic beings. He says if you take a Econ 101 class, or if you talk to economists, their models of economics is that humans are perfectly selfish, that humans are rational, and they are calculating. And so the idea is if you get a bunch of humans together, they will all seek out their individual needs, and that they can understand exactly what they need, how to get it, and they will calculate the best way to get it. Capitalist economics says that's fine. And in fact, social good is achieved when individuals pursue that self-interest. If everyone is pursuing their self-interest overall, it will become a social good. And thus, the purpose of corporations is to increase value for their shareholders, because each shareholder is looking out for themselves. If the corporation is increasing value for that shareholder, everyone is pursuing their self-interest, and thus we will find social good. In this kind of economics, the idea of regulation or any infiltration by the government or by anyone else is seen as terrible, because it will take away the ability of people to maximize their self-interest, and it will disrupt the way the market is going. Nick Hanauer is saying these are all myths. And if you think about it, if you look at yourself, would you claim to be perfectly selfish? In all of your actions in your day-to-day, are you acting selfishly? Do you not do anything for anyone else? Do you not consider other people in your day-to-day lives? And that's probably not true. And so what Nick Hanauer is saying, we need to do something different in how we think about who humans are and how they act, and create an economic system that responds appropriately. So he talked to a historian called Dr. Harari, who is an Israeli historian who wrote the book Sapiens, in which he was trying to evaluate what is the reality of human life over time. And he says that what actually separates humans from the rest of animals is not that we are selfish. It's not that we are rational or that we are calculating. It's that we actually, the only thing that sets humans apart really is that we are really good at cooperating in huge numbers. Most other animals aren't that great at cooperating beyond a small group of like 20. Whereas as we see today, the entire, global economy is cooperating at a very large scale. And he says this is because of our ability to create, spread, and believe in fictional stories, whether that is a myth, a religion, even just the idea that a dollar bill represents money, whether it's accepting the authority of a government. These are all fictional, right? If the entire US today decided that the Supreme Court isn't worth following anymore, then the Supreme Court's power would, it would go away. There is not necessarily any tangible power that the Supreme Court has, except that we as a society agree, implicitly or explicitly, to abide by its concepts. But if tomorrow we decide, no, we don't want to do that, then it wouldn't have any power and they wouldn't get money. They don't have any ability to force us to do anything, right? So that is what he means by fictional stories, is that the entire population of the US, or at least the majority, accepts the Supreme Court's laws and we abide by those laws. However, it doesn't have to be that way. Now, this gets a little more complicated when you think about power. So, for example, if the majority of the population decided not to follow the president anymore, the president does have the military. So there are, and individual cities have police, they have the National Guard. So there would be force involved. But if those groups decided to go along with the rest of society, the government would collapse. So that's what Harari means by the government is a myth or a fictional story, is that it only exists in that we as a society agreed to believe in it, that we agreed to follow it. And so humans, by very nature, are moral and trusting beings. When I go to Julasco, for example, and I take a bag of apples and I give them $10, they are trusting me that those $10 are actual money. They are trusting that if they take that $10 and put it in the bank will have that money, right? It's all a big issue of trust. I am trusting that the bag of apples I've taken aren't pumped of steroids and rotting in the middle, right? So everything we do is based in trust with each other. And so this is what Dr. Harari and Nick Hanauer are arguing are the true realities of human life. It's not that we're selfish and calculating. In fact, it's that we are trusting. We're not rational. We believe in these myths, and that we are social beings that cooperate. So this is how the myths of what it means to be human, and the realities of human. Now let's look at what Nick Hanauer calls the myths of neoliberal capitalism and the realities. He argues that what you have been told all of your life is that taxes for the rich and corporations will kill growth and create jobs. Raising wages will kill jobs, and regulation kills growth. And this is probably something you've heard over and over, both in politics and in the ways corporations talk to you, is that this is the trickle-down economics idea, right? If corporations and the rich have more money, then they can invest and they can create more jobs, and those jobs will then give poorer people money, and those poorer people's money can then go into the economy, right? And so if you tax the rich, then you're killing that growth, and you're destroying jobs. Nick Hanauer is saying never in the history of capitalism has this ever been true. And he says, what a devious myth to tell people that If we lower taxes on the rich, we suppress wages for everyone else, and we deregulate companies, then it will all work out better for the poor, right? Everything that benefits the rich also benefits the poor, is what he's saying. And he's is the myth of capitalist economics, and he says that's not true. He says jobs are created by consumers. The only times jobs are created is when there is demand for products. And if we aren't creating a demand for products, then there won't be jobs. And if poor people, the middle or the working class and the middle class don't have money, then they won't be creating demand and there won't be a creation of jobs. He, as a capitalist, says the average corporation's last resort is to create a job. And they only do it when that demand is high, because think of everything that goes into creating a job. You have to pay for the wages, you have to pay for the training, you have to pay for healthcare, and maybe you have to help someone move, right? It is a heavy investment to create a job. And so most corporations are going to do everything they can not to create a job. We see this today in the gig economy. So all of these apps like DoorDash, Uber, Lyft, even the big tech companies like Google, Amazon, they've created contract work because that's far cheaper than creating a stable job. Contract workers don't have access to healthcare. They don't have access to wages or like a minimum wage law. And so it's a way that corporations have avoided creating jobs by creating contract workers. Even though there is a demand, they're trying to skirt by creating jobs. And so they are arguing that regulation, or Nick Hanauer says, regulation prevents capitalism's tendency for extreme inequality. This is happening in, for example, in California right now. A lot of the contract workers like Uber, like Lyft, like DoorDash are trying to unionize and put into law that these companies have to provide a stable income and have to provide healthcare if their employees work more than 35 hours a week, right? If a contract worker is acting like a company or like a job, like a full-time employee, then they should be treated like a full-time employee with all of the benefits. And these companies are paying millions of dollars to stop this. They do not want to have to pay these people money or provide them an adequate living wage. So what Nick Hanauer is saying is capitalism doesn't tend to provide equality. It tends to provide inequality. Because what happens if you treat people as selfish? Rich people hoard money, corporations hoard money, right? It never works out for the benefits of the social good. So this is how we've constructed an economics that says inequality is good and is helpful, when in reality it's actually just hoarded money at the top and has not distributed money throughout the entire economy. Now, a lot of conservatives will say that well, the only way to make innovation is to pay people, is to have inequality. Because if, someone who is a janitor is making the same as a CEO or as a scientist, then no one will care about being a scientist. They won't go into those fields. And I would say, I can guarantee you that people would still rather be a scientist. And that it is a fundamental misconception to think that people are only in it for the money. The only reason right now they're in it for the money is because otherwise they won't survive. Whereas if people are provided a fair living wage in any job, then they will reach for the jobs that are innovative, that are exciting, that are new, that are solving problems, right? But instead, right now, they have to select the jobs that will pay for a family, and it's the only job that they can find. So this is the capitalist myths of who we are as people and what that means about society. Now we'll go into elite deviance and what that means. So this is a term created by some sociologists, specifically David Simon. But what you are looking at is a journalist, Michael Hobbs, who has reported on elite deviance um, throughout history, but most recently within the last 20 or 10 years. Um, so as you go through this, I want you to think, what is elite deviance? We're going to get to the definition in a second, but I want you to think, is it closer to white collar crime or is it closer to gangs? White collar crime is defined as a non-physical crime that is mostly intended to avoid payment or obtain business or personal advantage. So this would be like bribes. This would be like uh, stealing company property, something like that. Gang activity is defined by the Department of Justice and DHS as a group of three or more people who identify themselves with a group identity and whose purpose is to engage in a criminal activity with the intent to enhance or preserve an association's power, reputation, or economic resources. So white collar crime is avoiding payment or obtaining advantage. Usually it's personal and it's non-physical, whereas a gang is a group of people engaging in criminal activity to enhance or preserve power, reputation, or money. So let's see which one this falls better under. So who are the elite? This is, what's his name? C. Wright Mills's idea of the power elite. The idea is that there's an intersection between the largest corporations, the federal government, and the military. Their source of power is in information and what the idea is that they give to the public, right? So think back to what we just read about the myths of humanity and of economics, right? One of the sources of power of the power elite is to convince the rest of society that if they are able to act in their self-interest, then it would benefit everyone else. If they're able to stay rich and powerful, it will benefit the poor. And even though we just saw how that isn't true, this is the narrative that they've been able to feed through the military, or not the military, the media, through politics, etc. David Simon says that we can see evidence of the power elite that out of the largest 500 manufacturing firms and the largest 50 financial institutions, 2/3 of all income and bank deposits are controlled by less than 0.5% of the population. Half of all of the assets are controlled by less than 5,000 people. I mean, we have a country of over 300 million, and half of all of the assets are controlled by 5,000 people. So that's what he's saying. This is his evidence of a power elite. Now, if we have a power elite, what is elite deviance? David Simon argues that elite deviance are actions committed by this power elite that furthers the economic and political goals and pose a great danger to the public. And specifically, it comes with little risk or punishments to the people engaging in the harm. The harm, he says, can be physical, financial, or moral. So physical, we can think of the fact that 5 times as many people in the US die from job-related incidents than any murder. We can also think about, the Flint water crisis, that we've created an entire, water system that is poisonous. Financially, we can think of financial harms that, because of elite deviance, up to $231 billion is added to the cost of goods and services per year. That isn't necessary, whether this is an increase of unnecessary taxes or just markups or something else. And then moral harms. And he points to the lowest levels of confidence in political and economic institutions today because of actions taken by by the power elite. And to give an example of how elite deviance has worked, especially thinking of the connection between the military, the government, and economics, I want to review what was called the Banana Wars. And we're going to watch a short video. If you're not familiar with the Banana Wars, This is during the late 1800s to early 1900s. A bunch of fruit companies were trying to make as much money off of Central America as possible and ended up calling the U.S. military in on their behalf. So let us watch real quick the dark history of bananas. Let me know if you can hear it.
On a December night in 1910, the exiled former leader of Honduras, Manuel Bonilla, boarded a borrowed yacht in New Orleans. With a group of heavily armed accomplices, he set sail for Honduras in hopes of reclaiming power by whatever means necessary. Bonilla had a powerful backer, the future leader of a notorious organization known throughout Latin America as El Pulpo, or the Octopus, for its long reach. The infamous El Pulpo was a U.S. corporation trafficking in, of all things, bananas. It was officially known as United Fruit Company, or Chiquita Brands International, today. First cultivated in Southeast Asia thousands of years ago, bananas reached the Americas in the early 1500s, where enslaved Africans cultivated them in plots alongside sugar plantations. There were many different bananas, most of which looked nothing like the bananas in supermarket aisles today. In the 1800s, captains from New Orleans and New England ventured to the Caribbean in search of coconuts and other goods. They began to experiment with bananas, purchasing one kind, called Gros Michel, from Afro-Caribbean farmers in Jamaica, Cuba, and Honduras. Gros Michel bananas produced large bunches of relatively thick-skinned fruit, ideal for shipping. By the end of the 1800s, bananas were a hit in the US. They were affordable, available year-round, and endorsed by medical doctors. As bananas became big business, US fruit companies wanted to grow their own bananas. In order to secure access to land, banana moguls lobbied and bribed government officials in Central America and even funded coups to ensure they had allies in power. In Honduras, Manuel Bonilla repaid the banana man who had financed his return to power with land concessions. By the 1930s, one company dominated the region, United Fruit, who owned over 40% of Guatemala's arable land at one point. They cleared rainforest in Costa Rica, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, and Panama to build plantations, along with railroads, ports, and towns to house workers. Lured by relatively high-paying jobs, people migrated to banana zones. From Guatemala to Colombia, United Fruit's plantations grew exclusively Gros Michel bananas. These densely packed farms had little biological diversity, making them ripe for disease epidemics. The infrastructure connecting these vulnerable farms could quickly spread disease. Pathogens could hitch a ride from one farm to another on workers' boots, railroad cars, and steamships. And that's exactly what happened in the 1910s, when a fungus began to level Gros Michel banana plantations, first in Panama and later throughout Central America, spreading quickly via the same system that had enabled big profits and cheap bananas. In a race against Panama disease, banana companies abandoned infected plantations in Costa Rica, Honduras, and Guatemala, leaving thousands of farmers and workers jobless. The companies then felled extensive tracts of rainforests in order to establish new plantations. After World War II, the dictatorships with which United Fruit had partnered in Guatemala and Honduras yielded to democratically elected governments that called for land reform. In Guatemala, President Jacobo Arbenz tried to buy back land from United Fruit and redistribute it to landless farmers. The Arbenz government offered to pay a price based on tax records, where United Fruit had underreported the value of the land. El Pulpo was not happy. The company launched propaganda campaigns against Arbenz and called on its deep connections in the US government for help. Citing fears of communism, the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of the democratically elected Arbenz in 1954. That same year, in Honduras, thousands of United Fruit workers went on strike until the company agreed to recognize a new labor union. With the political and economic costs of running from Panama disease escalating, United Fruit finally switched from Gros Michel to Panama disease-resistant Cavendish bananas in the early 1960s. Today, bananas are no longer as economically vital in Central America, and United Fruit Company, rechristened Chiquita, has lost its stranglehold on Latin American politics. But the modern banana industry isn't without problems. Cavendish bananas require frequent applications of pesticides that create hazards for farm workers and ecosystems. And though they're resistant to the particular pathogen that affected Gros Michel bananas, Cavendish farms also lack biological diversity, leaving the banana trade ripe for another pandemic. You've probably noticed that when your bananas ripen...
Okay, so here we saw large companies like Chiquita who wanted so much profit that they were able to bribe or even overthrow governments to buy up land. And then anytime there was a threat, they called on the United States to help invade and overthrow any democratically elected governments that were trying to, get rid of these companies. So this is from an article about the banana wars. And here are some of the consequences that a lot of money and capital were siphoned away from the local people during this time, and that the banana war created a widespread distrust and antagonism toward the U.S., not to mention the overthrow of governments that led to dictatorships like we saw in Chile, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Cuba. All of these then dictatorships had massive, terrible effects on their populations, widespread deaths, etc. And so this is a great example of elite deviance, which operates at the intersection of corporations, politics, and the military. Because this is a fairly long lecture, I'm going to skip a couple of the other examples. One of the examples is PG&E's wildfires in California and throughout the West. PG&E has been a troubled company with troubled history. They've had over, I think it's like 60 different catastrophes since the 1950s, and they are still around, and frequently must be bought out because of their lawsuits against them by the government. Yet they are still the provider of electricity in California. You can also read through about the PPP during the pandemic. The PPP was supposed to be a paycheck protection program for small businesses, and instead it went largely to celebrities, to politicians, and to big businesses. During the pandemic, the 10 richest men almost doubled their fortunes, whereas 99% of human life in the world saw their incomes fall. And then the example 4 is financialization, where the idea of the finance sector is that the production economy, governments, and individuals would largely hold the money and sometimes dip into the finance sector in order to fund new ventures, whether that's a house, an individual trying to buy a house or a car, whether that's a factory trying to invest in a new product, or the government establishing a new program. Today, we see that the financial sector has become bloated and is where the majority of today's money exists. Most of the money today is sitting in stocks, bonds, buybacks, or some other kind of financial mechanism rather than in the pockets of companies, individuals, and the government. And so here is a video that kind of explains what you would do, what that money is doing. But coming back, so elite deviance, I wanted to just remind us that it is leading to inequality, specifically resources, opportunities, rewards, as well as risks. And so when we think of what is elite deviance, is it white collar crime, right? A non-physical crime to avoid the loss of money or business advantage? Or is it gang activity? Groups of people whose purpose is to enhance or preserve power, reputation, or economic resources. Elite deviance, according to the definition and our examples, seems to be a mixture, right? So because sometimes it's very violent. They bring in military, they overthrow governments. Oftentimes it is not violent, but it does do physical harm. However, most of it is done within the ideas of white collar, so it kind of is the white collar gang, this elite deviance. So those are the terms you should know from this week and the information. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions or if you want to talk about anything. But that's the information for the week. Have a good one. Darren, do you have any questions? I turned off the recording.